This is a Celebration 125 podcast. Our guest is longtime resident of the District of Kent, Bev Kennedy. And Bev, your association with this district goes back a long ways and you're involved in so many parts of the community. But before we get into all that, could you tell us about your family and your family's history in the District of Kent?
I sure can, and thanks very much, John, for doing this interview with me. I was raised in Harrison Hot Springs. I moved there when I was about 4, I think, from Vancouver after my dad got out of the Royal Canadian Air Force, where he trained as a chef. My parents were Pat and Elsie Keegan, and my mom was a very talented dancer and a painter. She taught ballroom dancing at the Harrison Hotel, where people loved to take a couple of lessons before they ventured out onto that Copper Room's lovely glass dance floor. I had 3 older sisters, only one of which is still living now, and looking back, growing up with a house full of girls was pretty good. In those days, we played endless card games and board games and spent most of our days outside in Harrison, hiking over to Sandy Cove or swimming in the ice-cold Harrison Lake before there was a lagoon, and generally having fun. As I said, my dad was trained as a chef and a cook, so he worked in many logging camps around Harrison Lake, and we would go and spend many summers in those logging camps with him, and that was great fun too. During the late 40s and 1950s, there were about 25 to 30 logging camps going full tilt around Harrison Lake. And the names I remember from this time and heard my dad talk about were, of course, Buster McCombs and Andy Lakeberg and Curly Chittenden, the Clark brothers, Dewey Anderson, Blondie Rustad, and Larson's Logging. And the names associated also with the people who worked on the various boats. And there was lots of boats delivering parts and equipment and the crews up to all of the logging camps. So those people were Denny Perrault and Percy Chandler and Captain McLeod. And of course, dear old friend of ours, Howard Welton, who recently passed away. I started school in Harrison Hot Springs for grade 1 and 2, I think, and then we moved a couple of times as my dad got work in Vancouver for a while. We eventually, of course, moved back to Harrison Hot Springs. I loved the small village of Harrison. In those days, we were about 300 residents, and of course, all the kids knew each other, and we all played together. When I was in high school, I could walk around the village of Harrison and name the people living in every house. I sure couldn't do that now. I also vividly remember the very, very cold winters. One year, the Miami River froze solid, and all of us young people ice skated for hours and hours on it. It was great. We also roller skated inside the Memorial Hall in Harrison, which was new then. The parent group had purchased those flat kind of roller skates that you screwed onto your own shoes. Mm-hmm. And of course, you had to have a skate key hanging around your neck to tighten them up. So that was fun. When I was a teen, our place to go was Greenpoint, which is now known as Sasquatch Park, and we swam in the lake and built bonfires and had corn roasts and had endless fun there too. I met my husband, Bob Kennedy, when I was 11. His younger sister was my best friend, and so we started dating when I was about 14 and married when I was 18. So we will celebrate our 56th anniversary in August. Bob's family has been here since the 1930s, I think. He is related to all the Edmondsons and the Bennywist and the Morrows, so his roots go very deep. He went to work logging up Harrison Lake when he was 15 years old and worked operating large logging equipment all of his working life. We are both retired or semi-retired now. So we have 3 sons and 5 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchildren, 1 more great-grandchild any day now.
When you mentioned your days going to school in Harrison, is that the same building that's the elementary school today?
It is, but it was half the size. So it was that profile that you see from the road when you go by. but they sort of did it a half at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So it was much smaller, but it is the same building.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say Agassiz and the District of Kent is certainly a great place to raise a family. And then when I got older, I went to high school in Agassiz, which is full of great memories for me. My sister Trish and I played on basketball team and volleyball team and participated in all the sports, and I was in the camera club. The school building then in Agassiz is the same as it was now, but it went from grade 1 to 12 in those days, and it had about 290 kids in the whole school. So a large graduating class in those days was 15 kids. So some of the teachers' names I remember, and other people will too, of course, is Ted Westland, John Klein, Amy Bennywest, Jeff Deesum, and Doreen Key, and many, many more. In school, I, of course, loved history and social studies and art and English, but I hated math. I still do. After high school, I lived in Vancouver to work for a year, and then when Bob and I got married, we lived in a logging camp in northern Vancouver Island, and then moved back to Agassiz, where we've been ever since. Talking about museum and history and things now, I was a museum groupie as a kid, and loved that musty, fusty smell when you walk into most museums. My strongest memory, I was thinking about this the other day, as a really young kid, was visiting the old Vancouver Museum on Main Street, and they happened to have an Egyptian sarcophagus on display at that time. And I thought that was the most fascinating thing I had ever seen or experienced in my life. And museum and heritage have been in my blood ever since. When my youngest son started school, I went back into the workforce and into college to take some night school courses. And I was pursuing psychology at that time and working at Chilliwack Community Services as a counselor and managing the crisis line, phone line at that time. So around the early 1980s is when I joined the new then Harrison Lake Historical Society, which eventually morphed into our Agassiz-Harrison Historical Society. At that time, we rotated to different members' homes for monthly meetings. The society included some of these great pioneer names like Joyce McCrae and Margaret McCrae and Ruth Broll and Roe Wally, Barney Pickard and Mary Gibson, and many, many more people. These folks were adamant that our heritage and history must be saved. So around 1984, we became aware that the Agassiz CPR station would be demolished. At that time, CPR was getting rid of a lot of their old stations. So we lobbied CPR to sell it to us for $1, which they readily agreed to do as long as we moved it off the site. So we negotiated with the research station for a lease of a piece of land to move it onto. So in 1985, Marnie Pickard and Carol Law and myself worked on one of the first grants that the society got to employ people. So we were given an office, rent-free, in the downstairs part of the municipal hall, out of which we worked and we planned on the move and the stabilization of this CPR building to become our museum. Also did a bit of collection work and welcomed visitors to this little tiny one-room museum in the basement of the municipal hall.
It's interesting how you eventually had the museum where it is in the CPR station, which you had moved, but that the CPR station itself is a museum piece.
It certainly is. The building itself is a historic building. That's why we try to take, special care of it. Talking about moving it, it was the coldest day of the year in November of 1985 when Nickel Brothers showed up early in the morning with all their huge house-moving equipment and lifted the museum up with their hydraulic jacks, adjusted the wheel system under everything, and towed the whole thing across the CPR mainline tracks and across the solidly frozen field to the research center. They moved the huge building all in one piece, and with the only damage being that I can remember were some slight cracks inside in the lath and plaster walls.
Mm-hmm.
But can you imagine, CPR closed that main line of tracks to all trains and gave us, and of course Nickel Brothers, a 3-hour window to move that behemoth, great big building across the tracks.
Now, in the memories book, it mentions the road highway closure, but they didn't really need all that time. Wasn't it about 45 minutes to move it?
Yep, it went really well. The Agassiz winter's east wind was howling that day the way it can at its top level. And I remember tears freezing on my cheek as I was sure the whole thing would crumple to a pile in the middle of the tracks. But Nickel Brothers were terrific and got the job done quickly with no major issues, and they were and they are real professionals for sure. And most of the town turned out to see the building move, but they all sat in their cars with their heaters cranked right up to try and keep warm. So I can close my eyes and see the whole thing playing in front of me to this day.
Wow.
So after the station was moved, of course, we hired carpenters, and we also had lots and lots of volunteers. Stabilized the building and rewired it and did the plumbing and painting, and we worked for months to get it ready because the next spring was Expo 86, and we did have it open for that. So the building is now our grand little Agassiz-Harrison Museum and Visitors Information Center, of course, and it runs with one paid employee and a small army of volunteers. So then a few years ago, the whole moving business of the museum reversed as the local government of the day decided that the museum should really be situated close to where it originally was and anchor that end of Pioneer Park. So once again, Nickel Brothers came out and moved the whole thing back to the west corner of Pioneer Park. And the Heritage Society was fully supportive of this move. It had been the best move ever for us. The museum, which I've been involved with one way or the other for nigh on to 40 years now, is certainly a tribute to thousands of volunteer hours and many dedicated people who truly value our community's heritage. And we look forward to many more special events and heritage speaker series and school programs and exhibits and carrying on the terrific work of the museum.
Bev, could you tell us about one of the projects that is the Old Kent Cemetery?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
That is a heritage cemetery, the old cemetery on Limbert Mountain. A few years ago, over the years, people have tried to take care of it and look after it, and sometimes years go by and not much happens. But a few years ago, the Mayor and Council of the District of Kent got together a committee that would like to really take a look at it and help to put together a conservation plan and do some conservation on the headstones and, get it in better shape. And that's what we've been doing. There's been a nice group of volunteers working up there for a number of years now, working on conserving it and doing some cleaning. We're going to do a lot more in the future. So it's been a wonderful project. That one has too.
Do you have a story behind the other cemetery that's near Agassiz Speedway at Ulm Park? How did that come about?
Well, the other one closed. The one on Limbert Mountain closed, and often people ask us, why is that on such a steep hillside? And of course, if you start to think about it, it's because those were the days of before any dikes, and it always flooded, pretty well every year on the flatland. So they put it on the side hill. It was getting pretty full. People didn't want it to have to haul things up there anymore. They used to use, donkeys and horses and stone boats to haul caskets up there. So then they decided to put the cemetery up near the racetrack there, and that's a beautiful spot up there also.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just going to talk a little bit about our museum and heritage. I've said this before, but I firmly believe that establishing a museum is sort of a rite of passage in a community. So when you look at the evolution of a town in pioneering times, at first you have a store of some kind and a hotel and a boarding house. Then comes the post office and the one-room schoolhouses, the church and the fire department, the municipal hall and the jail and so forth. But not long after this, then you start having sort of the library and other businesses and some recreation facilities. We've always had longtime residents and settlers who kept all of the old stuff, in quotes, and would tell stories about the early days. So pretty soon you have people getting together saying, we have a valuable heritage here. And for us in particular, you look at the First Nations population and their history around us. You look at the farming history, the logging history, and the river flooding and the dikes history. And of course, the gold rush history, when the first route into the gold fields involved a paddle wheeler up Harrison River and Harrison Lake and overland into Lillooet. So we have to have a special place to house and take care of our precious artifacts and archival material. Therefore, sort of the push to start an actual museum. And these steps were and still are echoed all across the province and across Canada, as place after place sort of does the important work of saving and retaining our history in perpetuity for our kids, you know. Over the course of the last 40 years, I switched paths completely from psychology, where I started out and took many museum and heritage-related courses, and then worked in many roles in many historic sites. So Kilby Historic Site I worked at for over 30 years, and Hayton Historic Site, which is Hatsick Rock, the Powerhouse at Stave Falls Historic Site, of course Yale Historic Site, and of course the Agassiz-Harrison Museum. So I've been kind of a lifelong learner, and I must say a late bloomer, because it wasn't until 1997 that I graduated from the Museum of Anthropology in UBC with their first ever museum program. And then just a few years ago, I graduated from UNSBIC with a cultural resource management program with a specialization in collections management. Also, I was going to mention, parallel to all this, I've been involved with the elections work for at least 4 years. So I've been Chief Election Officer here in the District of Kent for many years, and worked for Elections BC and also for the federal government. So that's been really interesting work, and I've loved doing that. The best things that I like to do are historical research and research for authors and genealogy and historical readings and traveling and camping, of course. So my roots and my husband's family roots go deep here. So I like to be involved in anything that's heritage. So that sort of leads into currently, of course, we were right in the middle of gearing up for our 125th anniversary of the District of Kent's incorporation. And we incorporated in 1895. So this year, 2020, was going to be our big anniversary years, and then COVID-19 hit. So a few years ago, the Mayor and Council had struck another subcommittee of the Parks and Rec to plan a full year of celebrations for 2020. So we have a huge team working. I know you know that because you've been helping, working on teams, planning the big homecoming event, and another team planning a Taste of Agassiz banquet event, and many, many more events and projects for over the course of a whole year. So right now everything has been postponed until next year, and possibly by November and December we'll be back at planning again for some of these events for next year.
One of the highlights I know for a lot of people is the speaker series at the museum.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've had great fun with the speaker series and large crowds of people out. So we've had people like Bunk McKay talking about history and the railroad history. We had somebody talking about the CPR history. Those have been great. To do those early in the evening. We had a whole series planned again for early this spring, but again with COVID-19 we had to stop doing all that. But they were very well received by the community, and we're going to be doing lots of those again.
Well, Bev, thank you very much. Fascinating stories.
Thank you.
Take care.